I am really proud to have this distinguished group of Free State Foundation members of our Board of Academic Advisors. I thought it would be good this year not to have, I've always wanted to have and have included members of our board in our program, and I've always been grateful for their participation. And sometimes I've been wrong in having them at the very end. And this time I thought it was important that we have them now. I think it's good, and we can put the chairman of the FTC, you know, at the very end of the day here. So thank you all for being here. Okay, now I'm going to start off. A lot of times, if you've been here before, you know I have a whole series of questions that might fit in the loosening up category, but I'm going to do that quickly just to get us started before we get into the real meat of things. And I'm going to ask, and this is like a lightning round if you watch the Sunday programs. I want each panelist. I didn't even introduce them, right? You've got your brochures, okay? So get the full information, but I'm going to introduce them from my right. And of course, we had these tent cards made, so they're going to hold up their tent cards as I introduce them, and then you look at the brochure for the full bio. To my immediate right, we've got Tim Brennan. Tim is professor of public policy and economics at the University of Maryland. Tim also is the originator of that now famous phrase, what was it, economics-free zone. There's a paper on our website that explains that. And he may or may not say more about that. To my immediate left, we have Michelle Connolly. Michelle is professor of practice of economics at Duke University. It's always important that we have a Duke contingent here. I asked Zion Williamson whether he might be able to attend, but he had something about practice or something or another. To Michelle's left, we have Daniel Lyons. Daniel is associate professor at Boston College Law School and a frequent participant. Very glad that you're here with us. And I deliberately did Christopher Yu last because he's almost always last at our programs, and you have my apology, but Christopher Yu, as you guys know, is the Chestnut Professor of Law, Communication, and Professor of Law at University of Pennsylvania Law School, and that's Communications and Computer and Information Science, and also Director of their Center for Technology, Innovation, and Competition at the University of Pennsylvania. So welcome to you all, and thanks. Okay, for the lightning round, just go down the row and just tell us, in order to get acquainted, what your favorite course is that you enjoy teaching and why. Christopher.
I teach a class called Advanced Topics in Technology and Policy that brings engineering students and law students into the same room. And we're trying to do interdisciplinary education in a different way. And I actually have a joint degree program. My JDs are getting masters in engineering.
Hi, everybody. It's nice to see everybody out there eating and working at their laptops and phones. It's kind of just like being in class, actually. Actually, I like teaching introductory economics the best because a lot of times people haven't had it, and a lot of people feel it, believe it to be a real eye-opener, and you get great questions, and it's fun.
Okay. By the way, as I've said in earlier sessions, please do tweet. You've got the hashtag on your brochure, hashtag FSF CONF 11. They probably might do that in your classes now as well. So please do that. Michelle?
So I enjoy teaching honors research, so students can do just about every single topic, and through that I've learned about auction theory and hybrid cars and stunting in India. So it's part of my continued learning experience.
And Daniel?
So historically, my answer to this would have been my first year property class, but I think lately my favorite to teach has been administrative law, and I think it's because it's amazing to me that students can get to their 2L and 3L year of law school before understanding that whole how a bill becomes a law thing that we learned in high school bears no resemblance to how policy is actually done, and that the vast majority of work by the government is being done in agencies.
Okay. Well, maybe let's do one more just so the audience can get to know you even better than they already do. What is the book that you have most enjoyed reading over the past year? It can't be a textbook, and it can't be one of the Free State Foundation's books as well.
So it's, I don't read much fiction, but I actually read a young adult book called Ender's Shadow, which is a retelling of a classic young adult book through the perspective of a different character.
As the happy and proud owner of 13 electric guitars, Bruce Springsteen's Born to Run.
There you go.
Michelle?
I sadly haven't read anything for pleasure other than Tom Hazlett's book.
Well, if it's anything like a Tom Hazlett presentation
It's
at an
highly
event,
entertaining.
then it would be entertaining. Okay.
So we just finished reading Art of Racing in the Rain as a family, which my kids really loved. On my own, reading Meditations by Marcus Aurelius.
Okay, well, that's pretty heavy stuff probably, but that's good. Well, I guess the summer reading season is fast approaching, and you can get a net neutrality reader by the Free State Foundation on Amazon in both the Kindle version and other e-readers and a paperback version. So if you're looking for something for this summer, I can suggest that. Okay, now, so let's delve in. And we're going to at least begin for as much time as we have in somewhat the same format that we did for the panel immediately preceding lunch. And then I want to talk about net neutrality first, and then talk about issues that fall in the platform accountability area. I know sometimes there's some bleed over, but we're going to try and do it that way. You know, one thing I'll say as we begin, and I can call on Christopher first, but I've talked about how at each of the conferences, since I started the Free State Foundation, we've talked about net neutrality, but you know, to sort of verify how long this issue has been around, I invited Christopher to come to speak to a conference or an event that was being put on. I think it was in 2004, 2005. That was actually a year or two before I started the foundation. Christopher was at Vanderbilt University then, and he had written a paper that really caught my eyes, being an important paper relevant to this debate. And he came up and spoke. It would be, I'm sure, presumptuous to say that and wrong probably to say I discovered him, but I think it was one of his first appearances in DC before he got to the point of saying he's a person that needs no introduction. So we've been talking about this a long time, but tell us, you know, maybe the easiest thing to do is just talk to us about your own view about where we are now, what you would like to see happen, and whether you think it might happen in, you know, relatively compact fashion, and we'll go down the line.
So I hesitate to handicap what will happen in DC because you're up to it, much closer to it than I am. So let me try to take it this way. I think that there are some technical and market changes that are going to that are eroding the idea of network neutrality as a discrete concept. So the edge and the net are becoming increasingly the distinction between them is becoming less distinct. and it's becoming much more integrated. So the first obvious thing, Comcast NBC merger, Time Warner's acquisition by AT&T. We now have companies that are integrated providers of both content and network, and you have a different regime where, as you see integrated services, you're going to have to ask, when does one regime end and when does the other begin? Interestingly, what many people aren't realizing is that on the edge, some of the edge providers are among the biggest builders of infrastructure in the world right now. You probably saw the New York Times article a couple weeks ago that says Google, Facebook, and Microsoft are the biggest builders of undersea cables. This is in addition to the Google Fiber build, and in fact, those companies are starting to sell their networking services, surplus networking services on the public market. They're actually becoming network providers. And so that's becoming much a harder distinction you have to draw, and the idea that we're going to have different privacy regimes, different neutrality regimes in different areas is going to be harder and harder to maintain. I actually spoke last Thursday at an event in Brussels on device neutrality. And the core of my talks was to dig through the initial network neutrality complaints and saw how many of them really were device neutrality complaints. The Metro PCS complaint was about a 0 rating for YouTube, which is intimately tied to the operating system and the media players available to a feature phone platform they were using to deploy LTE on 1G spectrum. We were looking at the Google Wallet aspects, which was embedding a functionality in the chip, and the Apple FaceTime case, which was about embedding it in the operating system. And then you can throw app stores on top of this, and what you're discovering is that the location of functions is arbitrary, and that in fact, technically, you can execute them in many different places in the network or in device or anywhere in the stack. And that in fact, we should allow innovators to be free to do that free of legal arbitrage. And as of right now, what we're seeing instead is that being likely to be responsive to rules created by law in a world where the consumer doesn't really care about the level it's done at, they care about the functionality and the competitiveness of the market that provides it.
Tim?
Yeah, thanks, Randy. I guess I go along with what a lot of people have said already in wanting some kind of legislation on this. My knowledge of the technology is far below Chris's, so I'll defer to him on that. I guess I would say on that, one thing is that whatever it looks like, it'd be nice to have it written in such a way that it doesn't, in some sense, stifle innovation in the sense that it allows ISPs, designed it the way Chris talks about them, say if someone wants to have a higher quality service and pay for it, that they be allowed somehow to do that. Whether I've often thought about whether to have a minimum quality standard rather than some sort of outright equality standard is a way to do that. Whether that's feasible or not for reasons that Chris has raised and others, I don't really know, but I think that'd be a better way to focus it. I'm quite sympathetic with the view that that price regulation here is not a good idea. It isn't because I'm, in some sense, a priori opposed to price regulation. I just don't think it works very well in an industry that's dynamically changing. If you're talking about like water mains or electricity distribution networks, all of that's changing, or some mundane things where technology has been more or less the same for a fairly long time, it works. When things are being changed very, very quickly, it's a less feasible way to go about doing things in terms of defining whatever it is you're regulating and figuring out how much it is to cost and providing incentives to come up with a new and better thing.
When I was doing the introductions, I probably should have mentioned that both Tim and Michelle are former chief economists at the FCC. I think Michelle even served 2 different terms, if I have that right. So we're obviously pleased to have them there. Tim, I'm going to, just because I mentioned it before, and because you were chief economist at the time when the previous FCC administration issued the 2015 order, and because you were quoted as saying it was an economics-free zone, maybe this is relevant to the discussion we're going to have. Just tell us what you meant by that. I know we published your paper on the Free State Foundation, but why don't you tell the audience what you had in mind?
When I said that, it was a setup for a self-deprecating joke to try to diffuse tensions at a small conference on the subject, and was not really intended to be any kind of pronouncement about what was going on. That said, the economics in the rather large 2015 order were rather scanty, and in some sense weren't very good. The so-called virtuous circle could as easily, where you want to hold down, the way to promote broadband is by making sure that edge providers don't have to pay anything to get on. One could just as easily have said the way to do this is to hold down, is to, in some sense, charge them money, and in some sense get and allow ISPs rather to charge edge providers for carriage, and that gives them an incentive to increase subscriptions so they can get a larger audience. I have no idea which, if any, of those is right, but it was that sort of thing. And I would also add, since Randy brought it up, that one of the things that I've come to learn or come to think about this issue, which I wish I'd thought earlier than it came to me, was that I think the downsides in terms of the cost of price regulation that people have talked about are real. I think the merits of it are really not economic particularly. I don't think it's a market power issue as such. I mean, to me, the most persuasive arguments have been things along the sort of speech rights, citizen access kinds of things. What that leads to, what that might support, I'm not sure, but I kind of wish that it weren't really an economic issue at all, and I think we've had a lot of problems trying to fit the round peg of this issue into a square economics hole.
Michelle?
So I have a few disjointed things that I want to say, but I think they're important within the larger context. So as Chris was mentioning, there's a huge change in the industry, a huge amount of increasing complexity because we have multiple layers all interacting, different groups, different layers are now doing the same thing that other layers were doing previously. At the FTC conference last week, the engineers were making it very clear that, for example, if you see that there's a problem, you don't know where the bottleneck is occurring, it's difficult to measure at what layer things are happening at. So this, plus the fact that we're seeing enormous increases in competition, not just between broadband providers, we have fixed and mobile broadband that are becoming more similar in their ability to provide. We have increases in content delivery networks. We have increases in private networks. All of these things are occurring, which makes it particularly difficult, I think, to think about any ex-ante regulation that could be written in such a way as to be flexible enough to handle all of these changes. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is I'd like to argue for a change in always using the term paid prioritization. One of the things I learned last year at the conference was that really this is not a notion of fast lanes or slow lanes. This is an issue of packet loss, that essentially if there is congestion, some packets get dropped. And so the idea of paid prioritization is that if a service, if a content provider wants to guarantee a certain quality of service, they want to guarantee that their packets don't get dropped. And that is what paid prioritization would be. But more importantly, let me just call it something else. Let's call it product differentiation, service differentiation. That's something that's very common. Service differentiation and product differentiation are very common in economics. That's a market. That's useful. That's efficient. There are customers who want that differentiation and would benefit from it, and not by trying to ban it by banning paid prioritization. You're actually harming certain industries from developing that need that guaranteed service. So you're harming potential innovation on the edge. And then the third thing I wanted to mention is this notion, again, that if you wanted to preemptively block paid prioritization, we've been talking about the digital divide. If you're trying to regulate prices and who is bearing the cost of things, well, if a content service provider who is creating congestion and wants a guaranteed service, if they can pay for that congestion, then you can offer a wider variety of services in terms of internet service provision to customers at different prices. Your pricing, you could offer a lower speed or lower volume of service to someone who just wants access but doesn't need, like my son, to be a professional gamer. And that would maybe help significantly with the digital divide. So the issues of pay prioritization are economic ones. I agree absolutely with Tim that I'd rather this not be an economic issue, but people keep bringing in the economic issues, pretending that they're issues of free speech, but really it's an argument for intervening in a market. And intervening in a market that we don't do that for the mail service. We can have overnight deliveries if we want, and we find that useful. So I just wanted to bring that back up.
Okay, well, that's useful, and I'm going to turn to Daniel, but this is gets to the nub of what I think is the core of, part of the controversy that sometimes is not talked about in precise ways like that. So I want you to be able, because you are an economist that was, with the previous administration. So you think about paid prioritization and respond to Michelle after Daniel.
Yeah, so just to agreeing with what was said before and sharpening the pencil a little bit to tie some of these themes together, I think one of the big rationales that has historically pushed the net neutrality movement is this idea that ISPs are in a unique position in the internet ecosystem. Sort of they have a choke point. And I think what we're discovering over time is that if that's the case, they're far from unique, right? So thinking about if one of the concerns is ISPs might block speech with which they disagree. Well, I can think of one time in the last couple of years when an entity has spoken in an unpopular way and has been blocked online for it, and that was the Daily Stormer after the Charlottesville, Virginia rally. And Daily Stormer, which is a neo-Nazi website, was taken offline openly because those who had power over them decided we disagree with what they say. But it wasn't the ISP that was blocking them. It was Cloudflare that denied them, and this Cloudflare denied them DNS protection, and then GoDaddy and Google stopped providing hosting services. I mean, we can debate the propriety of that particular commenter's content, but the point is, if we're concerned about there being gatekeeper that's opening or closing access to the internet on the basis of content, the Daily Stormer episode shows us that there's actually a wide range of potential choke points throughout the internet ecosystem. And so it's a mistake, I think, to focus on just one.
Tim, do you want to sharpen even further the discussion about paid prioritization specifically? Do you have anything?
Yeah, I think Michelle made a good point. First, I probably should say that, yes, I was in the prior administration. When I went for the interview, which is right after Mr. Wheeler became chairman, was confirmed, the issue that came up basically was about the transformation of local telephone networks from copper to internet protocol, because there were some legal and policy issues associated with that. That was going to be the big issue. The day before I started at the FCC was when the DC Circuit handed down the decision, Verizon case, that throughout the 2010 order, and shortly after that you had the Comcast Time Warner attempted merger and the AT&T DirecTV merger and so on. So the sleepy year transformed, without anybody really knowing it. As far as what Michelle, I think her example is really good, and I think brings out a lot of these points in that, yes, you have overnight delivery and postal and entry, by the way, but you also have it in the context of a service where there is a regulated minimum quality standard aspect, which is first-class mail. One can argue about whether that still needs to be regulated or so on. I don't want to get into that argument here, but the point is that you have that option available, but in a regime where you have, for 50 or 55 cents or whatever it is, you can get, a kind of a minimum quality, 3-day, 2 or 3 day delivery, whatever it is, service. So I think that's a really good example of the kind of things you want to allow and could even allow in principle within a sector that you were otherwise regulating.
The irony also is if you move it to a Title II framework, the point you're making about different classes of service, both of you, common carriage never barred that. I mean, you can always sell multiple classes of service. Daniel and I have both written about this. Yeah. And so the solution is always just to force it into a single class of service. Yeah. And particularly as we're looking at a 5G world where we're increasingly going to business, consumers are uniform, businesses are not. Right. And if you want to see the The poster child for product differentiation is going to be the 5G deployment, because the ability to do those kinds of differences become absolutely essential to making this go.
And I think it's interesting to look at the way the paid prioritization debate plays out compared to the zero rating debate, where I think there's more consensus on paid prioritization than there is on zero rating, even they're kind of getting at the similar issues. And I think part of the reason it's played out that way is that the market moved faster than the regulators on zero rating issues. So consumers were able to, especially in Europe, were able to appreciate the benefits of zero rating before the regulators came in and tried to ban the practice. So once you were trying to take something away, it became much more difficult than it was to bar an activity ex ante.
And the beautiful thing about that was the Verizon tariff that was essentially zero rating it, which was, if it's going to be a Title II service, 1-800 numbers allow the receiving company to pay the freight anytime they want. Right. And so they, what it looks like from another lens is pay prioritization, which should be a completely acceptable practice in a traditional Title II world.
Well, this is really nice because I can see you guys can just keep going without me, which is good. That's what I hope. So, we'll pick up the net neutrality discussion again probably next year, but I want to move on to platform accountability issues. I've just been using that as shorthand, and I'm interested to get your views. I know we're all there for the session right before lunch. We're talking about Google's and Facebook's on the one hand, and the ISPs on the other hand, recognizing, as Chris said, that there's convergence taking place, and those labels, can say too much if you don't keep that in mind. What I'm going to do, really, I think, is just read some of those questions that I read to the panelists at the previous session, and have these guys then talk about accountability with regard to privacy, or if it's potential social media harms. I could recite just within the past 2 weeks in each of these categories 3 or 4 incidents, ripped from the headlines, but we all know what we're talking about here, okay? So here are some of the intermingled questions that come to mind, focusing on privacy and social media and so forth. Do the platforms and/or the ISPs have market power that justifies regulation or other government action to control that market power? If so, do they have too much market power, or do they operate in a competitive environment within their market spheres? Should we rely more or less on antitrust law to protect consumers? Should we even consider breaking up either the platforms like Google and Facebook or others? Increasingly, there are suggestions that Google and Facebook be required to release to the public their algorithms. Senator Graham suggested this recently. As I mentioned earlier, Greg Walden did the same. Finally, should we rely more or less on the FTC to protect consumers? The states, the FCC, do we need preemption? In what respects and why should the ISPs and platforms be treated differently in getting law and policy right? I know those are a lot of questions, and I know they're intermingled, but if we tried to do this separately, I think we would find ourselves going around in a circle. So with those questions in mind, I'll start this time down here with Daniel. Just talk to us about the way that you think about some of those issues in today's environment.
I think one of the big difficulties that we've had with platform regulation right now, at least the way the conversation is currently taking place, is that it's very anecdote driven. Right, so a big Facebook data hacker something comes up, and it's all of a sudden that's the thing we all need to concentrate on and fix right now. And the difficulty with that, I think, is it's myopic, because and even if we talk about privacy generally, even thinking about privacy, just calling something a privacy regulation, I think is problematic, because it doesn't take into effect the idea that when we're talking about privacy, we're talking about data, and data is the lifeblood of the internet economy. Right, so when we're talking about whether we're going to grant somebody privacy rights or not, it's important to recognize that has a flow-through effect throughout the entire internet ecosystem. The way platform companies make money is by monetizing data. So if you switch, for example, from an opt-out to an opt-in regime, you're drawing up the pool of available data that can be monetized. Once that happens, you're either going to, you see one of two things happen. Either the quality of the platform is going to degrade in order to compensate for the reduced revenue, or you're going to see a need to raise revenue in other ways, right? For example, charging for things that are currently free, and that accentuates a digital divide. So I think it's really important to think about these things much more holistically than we do and make sure that whatever policy we adopt is not being driven by the 24-hour news cycle.
Michelle?
I'll focus on a completely different aspect, is the preemption. We definitely have seen brought up several times today issues with local governments, local municipalities causing difficulties for all different sides of our industries, and having local or state governments trying to create their own rules and regulations for something that really is something that we want to be building at a national level and have certain certainties and certain abilities to interconnect properly is very important. So the worst thing that we could have is 50 different versions of regulations in terms of internet service providers, or in terms of platform accountability as well.
One quick thing and one longer thing. The quick thing just on preemption is, as someone I've done a lot of work on the electricity sector in the last few years, and as someone who watched the California electricity market implode, there is a real virtue in not having one size fitting all. There may be something to be said for having 50 flowers blooming on how to do some of these things, and one should be careful about whether there really are interstate externalities that preclude that. That doesn't mean that there aren't, but there is a downside to uniform national policy on sometimes. The thing I want to say that's a little bit longer is this. Something where there is something about platforms, since this applies specifically to Google, and I'll explain why. The AT&T breakup in the 1980s has been mentioned. Some people may not recall, I was actually at the antitrust division then, that the same day that Assistant Attorney General Bill Baxter announced the breakup of AT&T, he dismissed the IBM antitrust case with prejudice. The difference between the two in Baxter's mind was that AT&T was price regulated for its local exchange service, and IBM didn't have regulated prices. That's a distinction that's gotten lost over the years, but it's an important one. Why do I bring it up here? Google isn't price regulated, but there is a big difference between charging a zero price for something and charging a positive price for something, and that all of a sudden you've got to get involved with monitoring, collection, all kinds of stuff. You have to do things are free. If those costs are big enough, Google may in effect be it's not price regulated in the sense that some government agency is making them do it, but they may be constrained into how much they can charge consumers for their service. If that's the case, then vertical integration may be a vehicle for them to exercise market power they can't through direct charges to customers. In the same way that AT&T's vertical integration arguably was a way of getting around regulation of local exchange. I'm throwing that out there. I don't know whether it would meet any other criteria for that. That's just an idea that sort of came to me, in some sense, listening from some of the discussion earlier today.
So what's interesting about platforms, I'm actually going to say one of the nicest things I've ever said about the 2010 Open Internet Order, which was it rejected the idea that the upper levels per se could not be the source of market power. Obviously, they don't have the same fixed cost structure, but they said it could be copyright, it could be some other aspect, but there's no reason that we shouldn't analyze those layers and try to understand them. I think that is absolutely correct. That said, the people who've been doing that kind of analysis lately of those layers have done a really bad job of the economics. So, to start off with the European case against Google's search platform, their first move was to declare that eBay and Amazon were not part of the market for finding comparison shopping on the internet, and their example was backpacks. If that were based on consumer data, I could accept it. I would love to see some consumer data about whether that's how people behave or when they switch. It's not in the order. The second thing that's really interesting to me is they just looked at the impact on competitors by looking at the fact that their market shares went down. That is an ambiguous fact. It could be that you've got an innovation that's made things better for consumers. You've created the proverbial better mousetrap. The real question is whether total quantity increased or decreased. And that is just totally ambiguous. The ACCC has a big proceeding going on where they've declared search advertising and social network advertising to be separate markets when there's pretty good obvious not only that these are advertising markets and they actually compete with broadcast television and print and everything else. But the one that drives me the craziest, they've created a new market for news referrals and declared both Facebook and Google to be dominant in that market. Not collectively dominant or collusive, dominant. And I'm sorry, in the words of a presentation I was this morning at the FTC hearings, the Ofcom regulator, a CMA regulator from the UK used the British euphemism. He found this analysis very brave. But this is what the platform markets become and the attempts that are doing there, and some very politically ambitious people are trying to make themselves as a name as advocates here, and frankly, they're just doing very bad economics in the process.
Okay, well, I'm getting signals from different people that, like time. I don't think there's a basketball game going on here. So I assume that Commissioner O'Reilly must be here.
Over there, yeah.
Okay, I didn't see him. That's great. But I don't think he'll mind. I'm going to ask one final question, and then you guys out in the audience probably agree. We have to bring these 4 people back. Maybe we'll do a whole conference with them. But look, earlier the T-Mobile Sprint was mentioned, and we talked about 5G deployment, and these are obviously important big topics. So while I have the benefit of your expertise here, in a last comment, I'm going to ask you, just with the merger and 5G, do you have anything that you think is useful to impart to us about that merger in the context of 5G, or just 5G itself as we close this out today? Who wants to go? Daniel, you want to go?
So there's a lot of interesting pieces of the Sprint T-Mobile merger. I think part of the most important piece is market definition, right? Is this 4 to 3? Is it really a 2-player market where you're building a 3rd player to go in? But I think the piece that's most interesting to me is the effect that it might have on home broadband market, whether in fact Sprint T-Mobile can do what they have suggested they want to do, which is to leverage the 5G network to offer a competitive player in the home broadband space to go up against cable and telco companies. The one other piece I think is really interesting, I haven't seen a ton of commentary on yet, is what effect, if any, the appointment of Attorney General Barr will have over the proceeding, because he has a ton of experience in this industry.
That's a good point. I think what I better do is just get one more comment. Michelle, why don't you do that, and then I promise you guys to be back again. You want to go ahead?
Yeah. So first, full disclosure, I did a study for T-Mobile related to this issue, so I want to put that out there. But particularly what I was looking at was the fact, so 5G is certainly going to allow wireless to become much more of a complete substitute to fixed broadband. And on the flip side, at the same time, we're having a case where cable operators only in the last 2 years have started to operate also as mobile service providers, because they are able to use their fixed broadband along with Wi-Fi hotspots and MVNO agreements with the major wireless operators. And so we have convergence coming in both directions. That wireless is going to become much or more of a substitute for fixed broadband, and cable operators who have their fixed broadband facilities are becoming more of a substitute for mobile broadband. So we see this convergence, and we also see an increased interdependence between these two. The cable operators need the MVNO agreements, but similarly, 5G in particular increases the dependence of the wireless operators on backhaul agreements. So all of this industry is really becoming much more competitive, much more interrelated.
Okay, I wish we had more time, but we don't. So please join me in thanking our academic board members, please.
All right, I guess I should stop for a second.
Thank you all, guys.